Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Iconoclast, Shinzo Abe and the New Japan, by Tobias Harris. Narrated by Ward Sexton. Politics is a strong and slow boring of hard boards. Max Weber. Japan's regulatory regime is like solid bedrock. I myself intend to serve as the drill bit that will break through that bedrock. Abe Shinzo. Chapter 1. The Last Heisei Prime Minister. 9 leaders, including a university president, a novelist, a newspaper chairman, and the head of the national broadcaster NHK, gathered at the Kante, the residence of Japan's prime minister, on the first day of April 2019. At the end of the month, Emperor Akihito would abdicate, and on the 1st of May, his son Naruhito would become emperor. It would be the first abdication in 200 years. The panel gathered that spring morning were responsible for choosing a Gengo, the new emperor's reign name. It was a decision invested with tremendous symbolic importance. A reign name becomes a cultural touchstone, a single word that evokes moments of collective trauma and jubilation that are the building blocks of the nation's identity. The Heisei era, Akihito's reign, began with the bursting of Japan's financial bubble in the early 1990s and would be profoundly shaped by economic malaise, natural disasters, political turbulence, and the awareness that Japan's population had begun its seemingly inexorable decline. The panel's decision would shape how millions of Japanese would remember much of the 21st century. At the highest levels of the Japanese government, 70 submissions from experts for possible names had been whittled down to 10, and then to 6, which were then presented to the panel. At 11:41 a.m., after the panel had finalized its decision and communicated it to political and imperial authorities, Chief Cabinet Secretary Suga Yoshihide stood in the Kante's briefing room, holding up a white placard bearing 2 Japanese characters drawn in thick black brushstrokes. Reiwa. Unlike previous reign names, which had customarily been drawn from ancient Chinese classics, Reiwa came from the Manyoshu, a collection of Japanese poems compiled during the 8th century. The characters came from a line referring to the anticipation preceding the first plum blossoms in spring. A short while later, Prime Minister Abe Shinzo mounted the stage to explain the decision. Just as the plum blossoms announce the arrival of spring after the harsh cold of winter, and bloom splendidly in all their glory, Abe said, all Japanese will be able to make their own blossoms come into full bloom, together with their hopes for tomorrow. We decided on Reiwa with the hope that Japan will be just such a nation. The Foreign Ministry recommended an appropriate translation, beautiful harmony. But the Prime Minister's critics quickly suggested a darker meaning, noting that in contemporary Japanese, a more appropriate translation would be commanded peace, implying Abe intended to put an authoritarian stamp on the new era. The notion that Abe would use the reign name as a declaration of authoritarian designs was far-fetched, and ultimately it would be up to the Japanese people to imbue Reiwa with social and cultural significance. But there are more subtle ways in which the selection of a reign name was a revealing moment in the life and career of Abe Shinzo. By April 2019, Abe had been the prime minister for more than 6 years, more than 7 counting a stint from 2006 to 2007. He would soon become Japan's longest-serving prime minister since the birth of constitutional government in 1889. But for Abe, too, the end was approaching. His 3rd term as leader of the Liberal Democratic Party would end in September 2021. His party had changed the rules once to enable him to run a 3rd time. It was unlikely to do so again. He, too, was contemplating his place in Japanese history. Abe had always been burdened by Japan's past and Japan's future. He entered the Diet, Japan's legislature, in 1993 as the heir to a storied political dynasty. As a lawmaker from Yamaguchi Prefecture, which until 1871 had been known as Choshu, he was acutely aware of its pivotal role in the Meiji Restoration, the revolution from above, that built the modern Japanese state that eventually set Japan down the path of empire, war, and ruin. A third-generation Diet member, he was the grandson of a post-war prime minister who had served in the wartime government and been imprisoned as a war criminal by the U.S. occupation, and he bristled at how left-wing Japanese and Japan's neighbors characterized Imperial Japan, and chafed at the U.S.-imposed encumbrances that had constrained Japan's independence. He regularly spoke of having a mission in political life. By his own reckoning, he would achieve great and necessary things for the nation, including important tasks left unfinished by his grandfather Kishi Nobusuke and his father Abe Shintaro. His destiny was not simply to rule. From his forebears, he had inherited a mission. He would carry out Japan's return to the world of power politics. The Meiji Restoration had made Japan a great power and a protagonist in the scramble for empire in Asia. The Second World War had left the country in ruins, and the U.S. occupation had stripped it of its pretensions to great power, saddling it with constraints, particularly a U.S.-authored constitution in which Japan renounced war as a sovereign right of the nation and the threat or use of force as means of settling international disputes, that would render it dependent on the U.S. for its security. Kishi, a member of the cabinet that had declared war on America, never accepted that Japan should be anything less than a great power, and spent his post-war career, which included 3 years as prime minister, battling the constraints the U.S. had imposed after the war. His grandson inherited this vision of a strong, independent Japan that could shed the vestiges of defeat and occupation. From Kishi, Abe also inherited a particular idea of statecraft. Leadership means pursuing bold measures in the national interest. A strong leader must do whatever is necessary to surmount the challenges of the age. As Abe said in January 2007, in order to realize a beautiful country, Japan, my mission is none other than to draw a new vision of a nation which can withstand the raging waves for the next 50 to 100 years to come. From the moment he returned to power in 2012, Abe aspired to close the book on the Heisei era as an age of national failure. The Heisei era had been characterized by the utter failure of Japan's leaders to overcome a decade and a half of deflation, ever-growing national debt, vanishing opportunities for young Japanese, the emergence of a strong and confident China, North Korea's increasingly potent nuclear arsenal, and the increasingly visible signs of an aging, shrinking population. Japan's leaders were a problem in their own right. Until Abe returned, since the Heisei era began in 1989, Japan had had 16 prime ministers, who lasted only 538 days in office on average. The nation seemed resigned to a steady, inexorable decline in influence. Abe was determined to banish that thinking. The nation must not surrender to malaise. The most important thing is to restore pride and confidence in yourself, is it not? He said in his first policy speech in January 2013. We, and indeed Japan as well, can surely grow every day in the future by uncovering new capabilities lying dormant within us. He was determined to be the strong leader of a confident country, eager to regain its rightful place as a world leader, not the prime minister of a demoralized nation resigned to steady decline. Abe would get Japan moving again. One by one, the fetters that had hindered Japanese leaders since 1945, a weak premiership forced to share power with bureaucrats, backbenchers, and opposition parties, a constitution that had limited Japan's armed forces strictly to territorial defense, and economic policies more interested in protecting Japan's markets then opening new markets overseas, would be broken by Japan's iconoclastic prime minister. Post-war institutions that had prevented the emergence of a strong activist state would come tumbling down. He would end the acute national crises that had paralyzed his predecessors. He would introduce policies that would get Japan's economy growing again and reclaim an international leadership role for what was still the world's third-largest economy. He would pilot Japan through an age of entropy as U.S. power declined and China and other non-Western powers rose, as emerging technologies created new threats and opportunities, and as humanity began to cope with the cataclysmic effects of climate change. In the process, he would dominate the country, marginalizing the opposition and breaking a fragile two-party system, while leading his party to victory in 6 consecutive national elections. It is only natural that Abe would be interested in the choice of a name for the new era, and it soon emerged that he had strongly influenced the panel's deliberations, suggesting that the group should look to the Manyoshu for a name. Reiwa, as explained by Abe, was a symbolic capstone for what he had sought to achieve. The name clearly resonated with Abe. He had experienced a bleak personal winter, having been forced from office in 2007, only 1 year after taking power, and endured public humiliation. But his political career had blossomed again, sooner than anyone had expected, and the lesson for Japan was clear. I am back, and so Japan shall be, he told an audience in Washington, D.C. in February 2013. After the hardships of the Heisei era, the Japanese people could still hope to enjoy the renewal of springtime. Defeatism about Japan is now defeated, he said in Davos in January 2019. But as Abe led Japan into the Reiwa era, he may have taught his countrymen that the challenges of the new era and all mature democracies will not be solved by strong leaders alone. While he has broken taboos, shattered constraints, and thrust Japan back into power politics, when Abe leaves office, he will bequeath to his successors a country that might be wealthier and more open to the world, but is increasingly vulnerable to climate change, unprecedented foreign policy challenge as U.S. global leadership recedes and China rushes to fill the vacuum, and a population crisis that has profound implications for the nation's economy. This book is a story of Abe Shinzo's place in history. Abe, the latest in a long line of Japanese leaders seeking a restoration for their own times, will be remembered for having girded Japan for global competition. Yet his legacy will be increasingly shaped by missed opportunities and postponed decisions to tackle the troubles at home and dangers from abroad that beset Japan in the 21st century. Chapter 2. The Birth of a Dynasty. The dynasty began with a strategic decision. This is the age of the newspaper reporter, Kishi Nobusuke said, after the U.S. military released the accused war criminal from Tokyo's Sugamo prison in 1948. The former Minister of Munitions in the wartime government of Prime Minister Tojo Hideki, he would be barred from politics until the end of the occupation as part of a purge of wartime leaders, yet he was already plotting his return to power. Nobusuke would have to adapt to life in a democratic Japan where mass politics was ascendant, so he decided that his daughter Yoko should marry a journalist. In June 1950, an acquaintance at the Mainichi Shimbun, one of Japan's oldest dailies, said he knew just the man. A young colleague, Abe Shintaro, was, like Kishi, a graduate of Tokyo Imperial University, who hailed from Yamaguchi Prefecture. He was not only a political reporter, but the son of a politician, the late Abe Kan, who had died in 1946. Shintaro called on the elder statesman, who was satisfied. A date was scheduled with Yoko. They began courting, with Shintaro visiting the Kishi residence at odd hours because of his grueling journalist schedule. On the 5th of May 1951, Yoko and Shintaro married. It was not obvious that this marked the birth of a political dynasty that would extend into the next century. Kishi was still prowling the margins of Japan's nascent democracy. As Shintaro was fond of saying, "I did not marry a prime minister's daughter. I got married to a war criminal's daughter." Shintaro, meanwhile, was an orphan journalist whose late father won respect for defying the militarist government. But fading memories of his father would not win him a parliamentary seat. In the meantime, Yoko and Shintaro started a family. Their first son, Abe Hironobu, was born on the 30th of May 1952, 1 month after the U.S. occupation ended. In April 1953, Kishi returned to the Diet. The following year, on the 21st of September 1954, Yoko and Shintaro's second son, Shinzo, was born in Tokyo. The young family lived literally in Kishi's shadow, near his compound in the Nanpei-dai neighborhood in Shibuya. During the early years of Shinzo's life, Kishi returned from exile and accumulated ever greater power. His political recovery was not entirely surprising. His life had been characterized by an indomitable determination to overcome the impoverished circumstances of his childhood and rise to the top of the Japanese state. Kishi was born in Yamaguchi Prefecture on the 13th of November, 1896. Although he would, like many children of the generation following the Meiji Restoration, admire the heroes of the Restoration from the prefecture, his family had at best only distant connections to the movement that overthrew the shogunate. His family was downwardly mobile. He was the fifth child and second son of Sato Hidesuke and Moyo, who ultimately had 10 children, 3 sons and 7 daughters. Hidesuke's surname at birth had been Kishi, but he was adopted into his wife's family and assumed her name, a practice not uncommon in Japanese families, particularly when there is a difference in social status. Hidesuke was a minor prefecture official, and when Nobusuke was 3, quit his job to run a sake brewery in his hometown of Tabuse, needing a loan from his wife's family for a license. The Sato Kishi clan recognized Nobusuke's abilities and made sure he got advanced schooling. The Meiji state, determined to modernize Japan to fend off the threat of Western imperialism, was building an education system to inculcate the skills and knowledge needed for national survival. There were ample opportunities for an ambitious child, even one of modest means. Nobusuke's education was supported by a series of patrons, including his paternal uncle, Kishi Nobumasa, who would become his father-in-law when he married his cousin Ryoko in 1919. Nobusuke eventually attended the first higher school in Tokyo, a secondary school established in 1886 to develop leaders for the rapidly modernizing nation. Like many of the school's graduates, he went on to Tokyo Imperial University, Japan's premier academic institution, enrolling in its law faculty in 1917. Kishi arrived in Tokyo amidst political, economic, and intellectual upheaval. The Meiji era had ended in 1912, giving way to the brief flourishing of party democracy known as the Taisho democracy. Increasingly vibrant opposition to rule by oligarchs and military elites resulted in Japan's first party-led cabinet in 1918. Japan joined the Allies in the First World War and participated in the Paris peace talks as a victorious power, but chafed at Western racism, while deepening its own imperial commitments on mainland Asia in response to the Russian Revolution, the decline of the European empires in Asia, and the birth pangs of post-imperial China. The war's end also triggered a recession, accompanied by rice riots and labor strife, which for the besieged elites were haunted by the specter of Bolshevism. Kishi plunged into the battle of ideas at Tokyo Imperial and flirted with radicalism, being especially drawn to Kita Ikki, a far-right thinker who sought to throw out corrupt politicians and business leaders, reclaim the emperor for the people, radically redistribute wealth, and pursue Pan-Asian imperial expansion. I was simply overwhelmed by the revolutionary spirit of Ikki Kita, Kishi recalled. Kita's call for a Showa restoration won a following among junior military officers who eventually launched the coup in 1936, assassinating civilian and military leaders before being quashed by loyal army units, and resulting in Kita's execution as a ringleader. At the time, however, Kita's ideas were just one of many responses to the political tumult of the early interwar period, and it may not have been the only radical ideology that piqued Kishi's interest. Kishi would shed some of his radicalism as he graduated from university and entered the ranks of the national bureaucracy. But he retained a bedrock commitment to the idea that, in a turbulent and dangerous world, the state must defend the nation from external threats, and that Japan ought to assume a leadership role in Asia as it struggled against Western domination. Despite performing well enough on the civil service exams to have his choice of ministry, in 1920 he joined the Ministry of Agriculture and Commerce instead of the more prestigious Finance or Home Ministries. This ministry, from 1925, the Ministry of Commerce and Industry, MCI, following creation of an independent agriculture ministry, enabled Kishi to harness his vision of a powerful state to emerging tools for the direction of economic activity. As Japan coped with the post-war recession, the devastation of the 1923 earthquake, and the Great Depression, its government became increasingly interested in economic planning and industrial rationalization that would let producers reduce their costs and compete with other industrial powers in the face of mounting protectionism. The MCI sought to curb excess competition and promote cartelization, and to focus state resources on the growth of critical industrial sectors, often generating conflict with Japan's pre-war industrial conglomerates, the Zaibatsu. Japan's commitment to state-led industrialization deepened as the Depression worsened, and Japan invaded Manchuria in 1931, establishing the puppet state of Manchukuo the following year. Manchukuo became a laboratory for experiments with planning and an indispensable source of raw materials needed for self-sufficiency in the event of war with the great powers. Manchuria offered a tremendous opportunity for an ambitious official like Kishi. As one of a cadre of reform bureaucrats who wanted the state to articulate national goals and shape economic activity according to them, Kishi made himself indispensable and acquired a powerful patron within the ministry, Yoshino Shinji, a pioneer of Japanese industrial policy. Yoshino brought Kishi along to ever higher posts, and by 1935, he had become Director General of MCI's powerful Industrial Affairs Bureau. However, Kishi's talents also attracted the attention of the military, which sought to bring him to Manchukuo to plan its industrialization. Reluctant to leave Tokyo, in 1936 he nevertheless accepted the post of Deputy Minister for Industrial Development in Manchukuo, wielding power under a titular Manchu minister. Kishi had the opportunity to implement a 5-year plan drafted by MCI, which would enable Japan to mobilize the quasi-colony's resources more effectively. The crash industrialization of Manchukuo was not successful. Kishi had to contend with the Imperial Army, as well as the Kwantung Army, a garrison in Manchuria that often acted independent of and against Tokyo's orders, as well as with the South Manchuria Railway Company, which had enjoyed a preeminent role in Manchuria ever since Japan gained a foothold after the end of the Russo-Japanese War in 1905. He struggled to secure new sources of capital needed to develop Manchukuo's resources. The outbreak of the Second Sino-Japanese War simultaneously intensified Tokyo's need for Manchuria's strategic resources and dried up external sources of capital. Industrial planning would have to wait. While the client state did achieve some sharp increases in the production of critical resources, this was less the result of capital-intensive industrialization than the brutal exploitation of Chinese workers. But Kishi's career benefited from his 3-year stint on the continent. He became part of a 5-man clique that dominated Manchurian affairs in the late 1930s, a clique that included General Tojo Hideki, commander of the Kwantung Army's military police from 1935, and chief of staff of the Kwantung Army from 1937, whose members would return to Japan to assume positions of power and influence, and achieve greater notoriety in the process. All 5 were arrested as suspected Class A war criminals after the war, and only 2, including Kishi, escaped charges. Kishi returned to Japan in 1939 and became MCI's vice minister, its highest-ranking bureaucrat. He resigned after a feud with the minister, but returned to MCI as minister in October 1941, after Tojo was named prime minister, ensuring that Kishi's name would be on the imperial rescript declaring war on the U.S. after the attack on Pearl Harbor. He served Tojo loyally as commerce minister, and when the MCI was folded into a new munitions ministry headed by Tojo himself, Kishi would serve as vice minister, organizing production as the war hit Japan hard. In the early months of the Second World War, Kishi launched his political career, comfortably winning a diet seat as a candidate of the government's Imperial Rule Assistance Association, IRAA, in the 1942 general election. But the war's endgame threatened Kishi's future. On the 9th of July 1944, the U.S. took Saipan, an island in the northern Mariana Islands. As a result, Japan's home islands were well within range of U.S. B-29 bombers. The implications for Japan's ability to prosecute the war were dire. Within days, Kishi joined a movement within the cabinet to unseat Tojo and seek an early end to the hostilities. Kishi used cabinet procedures to force the resignation of the entire cabinet, ending Tojo's premiership and Kishi's war. Kishi was not a principled opponent of the war effort after Tojo's resignation. He was planning for life after the war, when participation in a plot to remove Tojo could be an asset, a hedge to distance himself from Tojo in the likely event that Japan was defeated. This turn against Tojo throws Kishi's talent for survival, his willingness to shed political commitments as the situation required, into relief. Kishi spent the last year of the war advocating for greater state control of the economy. He used his parliamentary seat to pull together a group of 32 right-wing lawmakers into a proto-party, the Association for Defense of the Fatherland. This group sought to organize a nationwide movement to agitate in support of centralizing control of the nation's war industries and mobilizing the people as a productive army to resist invasion. He also created a local association in Yamaguchi Prefecture devoted to his Productive Defense platform and delivered speeches on its behalf. In the final months of the war, Kishi's association actually tried to topple Prime Minister Suzuki Kantaro as he negotiated Japan's surrender. But the end came. Okinawa fell. Tokyo and other major cities were burned to cinders. The U.S. dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Soviet Union entered the war. Kishi had, like his 70 million compatriots, to endure the unendurable and suffer what is unsufferable, as Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender on the 15th of August 1945. On the 17th of September, Kishi received word at home in Tabuse that he must report to U.S. military authorities in Yokohama immediately. He would spend the next 3 years and 3 months in American custody, mostly in Sugamo, as a Class A war criminal, accused of crimes against peace for his role in the war effort. But even as Kishi languished in prison, stewing over his treatment by his American jailers and nursing resentments of America, world events gave him a second chance. The Truman administration came to see that a rebuilt Japan, firmly anchored to the U.S., could help resist Soviet expansionism in Asia. Occupation authorities abandoned efforts to create space for left-wing parties and organized labor as part of a program of demilitarization and democratization, and in the words of historian John Dower, aligned themselves more and more openly with the conservative and even right-wing elements in Japanese society, including individuals who had been closely identified with the lost war. Kishi, who followed the news inside Sugamo, quickly recognized that tensions between the
Sample complete. Ready to continue?